So I'm Lizzie Simon. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Marland Institute, and I'm really pleased to have been asked to chair this panel on public services today, particularly because we're speaking about education, which is one of my major research interests. I'm only going to do kind of a short introduction because hopefully you've all got an idea of what we're going to be covering today. And this panel's sort of set in an increasing climate of dysfunction in public services and in education. So what we're going to kind of consider today is how a new administration might solve the staffing and employment crisis in our schools, nurseries, hospitals and care homes, and to kind of consider how a Labour administration would reform the NHS, look at new kind of proposals for social care and what the future holds for higher education. This session's going to run as all the others have today, so I'm going to give each of the panelists 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll move on to a Q&A. So I'm now going to introduce our speakers individually, and we'll run through in that order. So firstly, we're going to hear from Jonathan Slater. So Jonathan is the former Permanent Secretary for the Department for Education. He held this role from May 2016 to August 2020 and previously worked at the Cabinet Office, the Ministry of Defence and the Home Office. Since leaving the civil service, Jonathan has been a board member of the Institute for Government and is a visiting professor at the Marland Institute and the Policy Institute at King's College London. Now going to pass over to you.
So this is what an ex-permanent secretary looks like. In my bag over there are some clothes of the sort that current permanent secretaries wear. I was thinking I'd switch, but I bumped into Patrick on the way down who said this was okay. I've even actually brought my number 10 Downing Street cufflinks with me, but I'm going to put them here. Delighted to be with you this afternoon. A couple of months ago, government ministers made a big play out of the fact that youngsters in this country are the best readers in the Western world and the fourth best in the entire world, up from eighth only a couple of years before. If you dig a little bit under the surface, you discover that half of that improvement is because Ireland and Northern Ireland didn't count in the league tables this time round, because COVID meant they did their tests at a different time. But surprisingly few people went back to see how we were doing in the league tables 20 years ago. In 2001, I had a quick look to remind myself, and the answer was, in the world league table in 2001, we were third. And now we're fourth. Now, to be fair, there were fewer people countries in the test back in 2001, so let's have a look at the raw scores. Primary school kids, 2021, 558. 2001, do you know the answer? No reason why you would. 553. Up's better than down. Not a lot of change over 20 years in the reading performance of children in our schools. Why am I telling you that story in this context? I think because any incoming government should have a bit of humility. What can a new strategy from ministers, civil servants actually do on the ground? To what extent is it really our efforts that make the difference in the classroom? I would say a bit less than we tend to think. If you look under the surface of the analysis further, you see that where are we in the league table of the number of proportion of children who like reading, who enjoy it? This is a relevant consideration as to whether you're going to carry on doing it when you don't have to do it anymore. Are we fourth? Are we eighth? Are we 10th? No, we're 42nd. Which reminds me of an OECD report, the last PISA report for secondary school children, where, incredibly, and this was a really significant change over the last few years, the proportion of youngsters who were satisfied with life, being asked about this at school, was the lowest in the entire OECD. I mean, a lot lower. And it had fallen off a cliff in the last few years. 1 in 11 secondary school children are always sad. Always. So I remember saying to the minister who was about to go on the Today programme, what if they ask you about that? And he said he was going to blame mobile phones, and I said they got them in France too. Luckily for him, they didn't ask him that question. Damien Hines became my Secretary of State, and he said to me after a week, I've been asking parents what they want for their children's schools. And typically the thing they say more often than anything else is they like the children to be happy. And do you know how many times, he said to me, my new Secretary of State, after a week, I've heard the word happy in the Department for Education? Well, it was a lot less than standards or attainment or anything else like that, he said to me. And of course, this was before COVID. And now the levels of disengagement, I mean, the number of children simply not going to school, the issues of behaviour, mental illness, these are really big questions and challenges for any incoming government. They raise questions about assessment, curriculum, the engagement of families in education, special educational needs. There are going to be no quick fixes. These are not things which you can set out a nice, clear plan in a manifesto. It's going to require a lot of work by a lot of people collaboratively coming up with solutions for the future. What can we learn from other countries in this league table? Why not start with Ireland, since their children do read better than ours, and always do? And if you look into it carefully, perhaps unsurprisingly, you find that the children of wealthy parents do pretty much the same in the two countries by way of reading. It's the kids whose parents haven't got the resources who do much less well this side of the Irish Sea. And when you look into what have they done over in Ireland, why is that? Now, this is a broader cultural issue. You can't fix these questions, obviously, just in school, clearly. But what you do find is that this is a country where the education system has been focusing on trying to reduce that gap over time in a very consistent way and starts young. Why would any of that be a surprise? If we look at our own recent history, we find about 12 years ago, coalition government, Lib Dems, demanding extra money to be spent on pupil premium, Ofsted checking how well schools are using it to reduce the attainment gap. What happened over the following 4 years? The attainment gap fell. Lib Dems out of coalition, no longer an issue, no longer a focus of the government. What's happened to the attainment gap since then? It hasn't dropped at all, started to rise. So if you put a lot of effort into this, you can make progress over time. An obvious thing for a centre-left government perhaps to do. I asked when I became the permanent secretary, what is the attainment gap? What is the attainment gap? About 11 percentage points in terms of those getting 5 GCSEs of a decent grade. What's it for outstanding schools, I said, as opposed to inadequate schools? Oh, it's 11%. No, but in all of them. So it's 11% for outstanding schools and for inadequate schools, and for good and requires improvement. In other words, whatever Ofsted are inspecting, it's not the extent to which schools are trying to reduce the attainment gap. An interesting challenge for a centre-left government. And go back a bit further, when I say Ireland started young, Sure Start was a programme that started young, sought to take a holistic approach. What can we do before children get ready for school to help them do so as well as possible? So an agenda for an incoming centre-left government might well involve, I would have thought, a sort of partnership between schools, council, health, I've talked about SEND, to really try and drive up performance amongst those kids who are struggling the most. By the way, a really strong effort pre-5 could make a lot of use of some primary schools otherwise going to close, because there aren't the kids at primary school anymore. They're dropping off a cliff. So we could either close the primary schools or we could invest pre-5. It's going to be a lot harder than it was before, either in 2010 or 97, because there are a lot fewer teachers. There's a teacher recruitment and retention crisis, as we know. Kids leaving university considering whether they want to be teachers or not. Their mates are in the office 2 days a week, working from home 3. What's the offer from the school? If they go into school, they're working a lot harder, a lot more hours than in any other OECD country. So recruitment is low and retention is high. And so an absolute vital challenge for an incoming centre-left government will be creating a new partnership between the government and the profession in which people want to become teachers and want to remain teachers, whether that's investing in CPD, just speaking with respect. What's the current relationship like between the government and teachers? And then finally, post-school is just as important as preschool, obviously. And I would say for a centre-left government, further education would have to be the priority over higher education, assuming you're going to make some choices. And generally, choices need to be made, and Rachel Reeves has made clear about the financial context for a centre-left government. You know, the fact of the matter is that further education's funding has just gone through the floor, hasn't it, over the last 13 years. They receive kids who essentially failed by the school system, getting about 20% less funding than the school did for the kids who the schools weren't able to get through their English and Maths GCSE, and the college is told, with that money that you're getting, it's a lot less, you've got to get them through it. Well, what sort of a system is that? So a lot more investment is going to be required in further education. That'll be critical, of course, to an industrial strategy. It requires partnership again with local government. The mayors are well placed to take this work forward on the basis of skills agendas they've been developing, also with employers and trades unions in the way they would do in Germany as a matter of course. Finally, finally on higher education, I mean, it's hard to argue in the context of, you know, limited resources and many, many challenges, putting a lot of extra money into higher education right here, right now, which is not to say that university funding hasn't fallen in recent years. It has, but in the round, it would be hard to prioritise that challenge. I would just finish by suggesting two areas of focus. One, maintenance. For, again, if you go back to the kids whose families don't have the resources, it is a scandal that it's just simply not affordable to live whilst you're doing your degree anymore. A maintenance loan just is nothing like enough to live on. And so that has to be addressed. And frankly, turning a maintenance loan into a grant doesn't actually cost more. It doesn't cost much more, I should say, because maintenance loans from working class kids, they just never get repaid. Which takes me to my final point, this student loan system. I mean, really. One thing it is not is a student loan system. And I was the permanent secretary of the Department for Education, right? I was the accounting officer for this budget. It is a tax regime for 90% of the population of graduates. 90% of them are paying 9% for 40 years. There is a group of people for whom it is a loan, the richest 10%. For them it is a loan, and it's great for them because they pay a lot less than if it were a tax. Blimey. Why would you design a system like that? Answer, if it was a mechanism to get the funding off the balance sheet. If it was a mechanism to pretend for a while that you could have free money. Governments do this. Centre-left governments have done it in the past too, and it always comes back to bite you in the end, because it doesn't exist. So really, it is a tax. Call it what you want, and then you've got a choice. You could just tax graduates on the basis they're the beneficiaries, if you want. That's fine. That's a perfectly reasonable policy position to take. I don't have a strong view, although I do object to the notion that none of the rest of us ever benefit from the work of graduates. Most of the rest of us also benefit from teachers, nurses, doctors, you know. So you could argue either way. But please, let's stop calling it a loan. Thank you very much.
Okay, so next we're going to have Clare McNeil, who's an Associate Fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research, speaking to us. She's also the founder and chair of the London Progression Collaboration, which seeks to break down barriers to good quality work for disadvantaged and marginalised young people across the UK.
Stand at the lectern too. Well, first of all, thank you so much to the Mile End Institute for this conference today. I think it's great to have the chance to focus on these questions, which I think we're all going to be thinking about more as we approach an election. So firstly, what might the first few years of an incoming centre-left government actually feel like, given in particular the dire economic outlook? And secondly, what is the 5 to 10 year transformation project on public services that a centre-left government would actually hope to achieve if it was successful at the next election. And you've shown your commitment to these questions by being here on what is probably the hottest day of the year. So for the centre-left and for the Labour Party, I think it's really going to come down to three things that I'll focus on today. So firstly, tax and spending. Secondly, where public services fit into Labour's economic policy, its industrial strategy, and also its wider programme of reform, for example, on devolution. And then finally, on long-term ambition, so being really clear about what a centre-left government would aim to deliver for people and what that means for the UK's social and economic model. And the main point I want to make today is that I think this will stay quite unclear unless Labour really integrates its social and economic agendas in a way that we saw under Attlee, for example, but probably haven't seen since, even under New Labour. So firstly, decisions on tax and spend. Increasingly ahead of the next election, we're going to see short-term fiscal policy come up against the reality of over a decade of underinvestment in our public services, but also the longer-term residualisation of our welfare state, which we hear less about. As somebody said this morning, it can feel like there is a lot of heat, but little firepower in response. And just to set the context for this, I'll set the scene for what an incoming centre-left government would face on public services without trying to depress you too much. The Institute for Government has a fantastic performance tracker for public services, which it's been publishing for years. And for many years, the lights have been flashing green, a bit red, a bit yellow. Now they're all flashing red. Public services are unable to keep up with rising demand is the real story. And spending plans for 2025 to 2026 are even less generous than now, which means that, you know, for an incoming government, this situation is going to be even harder to turn around. So this would be one thing if standing still were an option, but it's not. And 2 points on this. Firstly, as we know, demand for public services is rising, and that demand is becoming more complex with falling life expectancy, the myriad impacts of COVID-19, and of course, an aging population. Secondly, the crises within our public sector workforce, as we've just heard from Jonathan, now pose arguably just as big a challenge as that rising demand. So in addition to the impact of strikes, we're seeing a vicious cycle across health, across care, across education, in particular, but really across many of our public services, of chronically low levels of recruitment and retention, of low morale of staff, all of which are compounding years of underinvestment. Now, Labour has set out some funded plans to boost training and recruitment in some services, and the push for fair pay agreements could make a real difference in social care and childcare. But on public sector pay, any incoming government is going to face some huge tests. Pay restoration right now looks like it could only be funded by finding departmental savings, which, as we know, are pretty hard to come by at this point. But if the workforce crisis doesn't substantially improve, the risk is that we'll see diminishing returns from the investment we already have, and of course this poses big challenges for an incoming government and any future reform agendas is looking to achieve. Now, it's not all about investment. A huge amount can be achieved through devolving and reforming our public services, and I'll come on to that. But we can't pretend that that is cost neutral either. So at this point in an electoral cycle, we would expect a certain amount of ambiguity, but a clearer focus on the long term could really help generate momentum and interest this side of an election and clarify that vision, that long-term vision for a future government. So 3 suggestions on this. Firstly, a more integrated social and economic model. Now, that may not sound exciting, but the Nordic states have been showing us for years that the economic prosperity is just as dependent upon having a strong welfare state as the other way round. And if your long-term economic model is going to shift, which I think Labour wants it to, away from a consumption-based economy to one that's more focused on investment, then you also need a long-term plan to shift your social model. And as we heard this morning, I think that means more long-term plans for health, for childcare, as we're seeing through Labour's 5 missions, childcare and social care as integral parts of a more productivist economic agenda and not separate to it. So that means, for example, 5 to 10 year plans for expenditure, not just annual expenditure plans, and a stronger focus on the institutions that will be needed to support reform. To my mind, a more investment-based economy also requires a stronger role for apprenticeships, for training and for skills, and much more coordination with employers in those areas. And it's interesting that the Inflation Reduction Act from the US that has really inspired Labour has those sorts of plans at its heart. Rachel Reeves' focus on the everyday economy also provides the basis for a much more integrated social and economic approach. And the Welsh Government is doing some fantastic work here on disrupting and innovating in what's called the foundational sectors of our economy, so that's public services, but also sectors like retail, leisure and hospitality. And these constitute the economy in many parts of the country, and they employ 40% of the workforce overall. So it would be great to see a 5 to 10 year plan to raise the quality of jobs in these sectors and to build up the workforce that we really need to deal with the rising and changing demand that I mentioned, as well as the net zero transition. Then secondly, an ambitious reform agenda. Our public services can't keep just doing more of the same. So central government, as we've heard, and I really just mean Westminster here, is now literally decades behind other countries like the Netherlands, for example, in experimenting on devolution and greater citizen participation in public services, which all of the evidence suggests lead to better outcomes. So I'd like to see, rather than perhaps just individual departmental plans, a white paper on the sorts of public sector reforms we need across government. And I think the Gordon Brown agenda on the future of the UK provided a really fantastic starting point for that, actually. Thirdly, targeted investment pledges. While we're unlikely to see big spending commitments until the economy recovers, both in policy terms and politically, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that some additional investment will be needed, not least for the sorts of symbolic spending commitments that will be needed to paint a picture of where the Labour Party wants the state to deliver for people and how it's going to get there. So I've already set out what some of the priorities for this could be, on skills, on childcare, for example. But what I think it means is that we need a serious debate on the case for borrowing to invest in social infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure, as well as digital infrastructure. And this would not only boost current demand, but ensure that the right conditions are in place for future growth. Equally, many organisations, including IPPR and economists such as Aaron Avani, have made the case for tax reforms on national insurance contributions, for example, on capital gains tax, inheritance tax, that could also fund short-term targeted investment pledges. And we need these reforms not just to fund our public services, we urgently need them for that, but also because they are necessary for tackling inequality, which in turn is creating some of the greater demand that our public services are having to deal with. So just to draw it to a conclusion, that's a summary of some of the challenges an incoming government will face, hopefully a centre-left government, and hopefully some of the answers to the questions I started off with, how to deliver change that people can really feel in the first few years of a new parliament, and more clarity on what the 5 to 10 year transformation project a centre-left government should be aiming for if it's successful at the next election.
Thank you very much, Claire. So we're now going to be passing on to Andrew Harrop, who has been the General Secretary of the Fabian Society, the UK's oldest think tank and political society, since August 2011. So Andrew leads the Fabian's research on economic and social policy and is currently leading a review on the creation of a national care service.
Thank you, Lizzie. And I'm no longer leading a review on the National Care Service because it was published last week. So I have a sense of the weight coming off my shoulders. And I'm going to talk about that review today. I think really it's a case study of the wider issues that Clare has just been talking about. So let me sort of try and narrow in to all those dilemmas facing an incoming government, but just from the perspective of adult social care. So last week, the Fabian Society launched our proposals for a national care service. We were asked by Wes Streeting and Unison to examine how to gradually build a new system of adult social care for England, to set out a direction of travel, exactly as Clare has just said, over 5 to 10 years of long-term transformation, but expecting it to be a gradual, slow process that wouldn't be achievable in the very short term, partly for financial reasons, but also for the scale of reform that is needed. The purpose of the project was to fill a gap that has existed ever since Labour first committed to the idea of a national care service before the 2010 election. Until now, that policy has consisted of a few words in election manifestos, but not detailed plans for reform or implementation. And we were delighted to work with both Unison and Labour, and by their commitment to the idea of a national care service. But it's really important to stress that these are our ideas and not theirs, advice, not policy. So the backdrop to this project is an adult social care system on its knees, as with so many other parts of the public services. This winter's hospital discharge crisis was only a symptom of much wider problems. Since 2010, spending on adult care has fallen hugely relative to levels of need. Access to care has been unfairly rationed, and many people who need help are going without vital support. Publicly funded provision is often patchy, impersonal, and inadequate. Poor pay and conditions have helped trigger yet another staffing crisis. In this case, there are 165,000 vacancies out of a workforce of a bit over 1 million. Unpaid family carers are picking up the pieces, and people receiving support are paying charges they often find punishing. But we're clear that extra spending will not be enough on its own to address these problems. Money must come with reform. In our report, we make 48 recommendations. You'll be very pleased to hear. I'm not going to run you through them all. Instead, I'm going to highlight 5 key themes that really come out of our conclusions. The first is we need a fair workforce settlement, exactly the sorts of reasons we've already heard from previous speakers. In order of sequencing, this is where to start, because if we don't make progress towards a new deal for care workers, we will not be able to recruit and retain the people the system needs, either now or in the future as demand rises. In the report, we call for a sector-wide fair pay agreement negotiated between government, trade unions and employers, which would include an adult social care minimum wage and minimum employment conditions. These would apply to everyone in adult social care, whoever employs or pays for you, although there would be some flexibility for directly employed personal assistants working for people using personal budgets. Going further, people working for independent providers contracted to the new national care service that we propose would have national pay bands and employment terms designed to achieve parity over time with similar roles in the NHS. As it becomes affordable, and it is an expensive policy, we should aim for our publicly funded care workforce to have the same rewards, respect, and career structure as their colleagues and partners in healthcare. Second, we want to build a care service that is for everyone. Under our plan, support will be available to anyone needing help, regardless of their means. There will be an end to the current binary divide between people receiving local authority support and people who have to pay for their own services, with everyone inside the tent. And help will be there at an earlier stage, as people's care and support needs develop. with resources set aside for preventative open access, community-based support, and housing adaptations. People known to be disabled or carers would be automatically referred to the new service by the NHS or the DWP. The National Care Service would then reach out to you rather than you having to fight to find it. The goal of this package is for everyone to have peace of mind about help being there for them when they need it. Third, we want to build a system with stronger rights and entitlements. Citizens' rights should be spelled out in a National Care Service constitution, co-produced with disabled people, older people, and carers. People would then have control and choice over the support they get. We call for a new right to choose where people live and to take part in society, built on an existing United Nations Convention for Disabled People. Unpaid carers should be asked how much they wish to care, and they should have a new right to short breaks to make sure that their caring relationship is sustainable. And we also think there should be a formal appeal process in the social care system, which was legislated for under the coalition government, but never introduced. The fourth point is that we want to turn adult social care into a comprehensive public service. Under the plan, the National Care Service would offer end-to-end support under a shared brand delivered together by national government, local councils, and licensed care providers. National government would have new responsibilities for leadership, investment, workforce, and financial regulation of providers. Essentially, we envisage the roles of the Secretary of State being the same as they are for the Health Service as for the National Care Service. Today, in law, the adult social care is not the responsibility of national government, only councils. Local authorities would receive the funding they require to meet the needs in their area and the flexibility to commission the services that are right for their community. And independent providers, who still today deliver 90% of adult social care, would be expected to operate as part of a public service. They should be fairly funded, but with new standards of care quality, workforce, and financial conduct. And then the fifth and final principle is that over time, services should become more affordable. Reforms to care funding should run in parallel with other changes. They shouldn't dominate the debate on adult social care, as sadly they have too often for the last 15 years. But as services improve over time, the extent of charging should decrease. Incoming ministers after an election, we think, should match any government funding reforms that are announced before the election or in the next Conservative manifesto. But they shouldn't go further without having full sight of the options. So if elected, they should then develop both the new service and consider other funding options, like making care free for people with lifelong disabilities. This package would take a lot of time and effort to deliver, both because it is in the short term too expensive to be implemented in one go, and because we need the capacity to develop to actually deliver it. But as well as thinking about it in terms of the price tag in the first 1 or 2 years, I think it's incredibly important, returning to Clare's remarks, to think about the 10-year journey of travel, not just of reform, but of funding. If an incoming government makes a commitment to 10 years of annual increases, that will give the system the ability to grow, to build capacity, and to start investment in infrastructure, which frankly has only been possible through the private sector, and particularly private equity, over the last 15 years. So long-termism and certainty will actually deliver far better results, even with the same amount of money, than the stop-start emergency funding settlements we've had for health and social care over recent years. This is a package that we think is comprehensive for everyone. It creates national guarantees, but it is also rooted in localism and personal control of services. And it creates a single public service, getting to the Nye Bevan vision of the Secretary of State being responsible for the bedpan dropping in adult social care as it has always been with the NHS. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So we're now going to move on to hear from another Andrew, but this time it's Andrew O'Brien, who's Director of Policy and Impact at Demos, and was previously Director of External Affairs at Social Enterprise UK. He's a regular writer and commentator on the economic and social problems facing the UK, and is the author of the Conservatism in Exile Substack.
I felt like I had to stand up, everybody else did. So, and I'm also a bit jealous of my fellow Andrew, because I don't have a commission to pull out of my back pocket, so I'm just having to kind of talk a bit more broadly. But thank you very much for the invitation today. Demos, as some of you will know, is a kind of cross-party think tank. We've been around for about 30 years, not quite as long as the Fabian Society, but still very much in our mature phase. And public service reform is a big deal of what we work on. And I guess I just had 3 points I wanted to make, and I'm just conscious of time and questions as well. Otherwise, if I keep rabbiting on, you won't get to ask any. So I'll try and keep these snappy. I think the first is, what does the centre-left think a vision of a good society looks like? Because your public service reform agenda needs to reflect what that vision is. And I would just kind of reflect on another conference that took place a few weeks ago, just around the corner at the Emmanuel Centre, the National Conservatism Conference. Now, I'm not saying you should all follow their prescriptions, but what was interesting was they suddenly had a light bulb moment in many parts of that conference where they realised, hang on, our vision for society is about family, community, responsibility. And yet our public services are about individualism, marketisation, monetisation. These things do not add up. These are not the same. And that started a really interesting fight, for want of a better phrase, about what the good society looks like, what that vision looks like. I think, to kind of sound the Attlee klaxon again, Attlee and his government had a very clear vision of what society should look like. They built their public services system on the idea that there would still be a lot of kind of family and community and charitable provision. They had a very organic view of what that would look like. Yes, they wanted professionalisation of services, but a lot of it was around that sense and that feeling of kind of solidarity and building on kind of working class movements and mutualisation over generations previously. And they built their public services to deliver that vision. And I suppose the question for the centre-left is that your vision? Is it a different vision? Where are you going? Because if you don't figure that out, none of your reform agenda will work, and you'll be coming back to another conference here in 10 years' time going, where did it all go wrong? Why have we not got the outcomes we're looking for? So I think that's an important element. The second is, and I guess this is what we're working on a lot at Demos at the moment, is, what does this new public service reform paradigm look like? Because you do need a comprehensive strategy to figure out how we're going to deliver the future of public services, whether it's in education, care, health, etc., because they have to cohere, they have to come together. We just published a paper a few weeks ago called The Preventative State, which has been written by my colleague Ben Glover's in the audience here, and Polly Curtis, our chief executive, myself. And we looked at a couple of elements of what that paradigm could look like. One, I think, what we called foundational policy. So again, I guess this probably sounds banal to the point of kind of stupidity, but public services are required when social kind of outcomes, communities break down in parts, where the kind of traditional structures that we build our lives around don't necessarily work. And if you really want to reform public services and make them sustainable, you have to get to the source of those challenges. And if you don't have strong communities, you don't have strong families, you don't have strong social bonds and connections, it's very difficult to build any public service system that's going to be able to replace that. And I think there has been a little bit of unreality in the centre-left, I think, around some of that. I think a belief that if the state just keeps spending more and more money, if we build bigger and bigger public and private institutions, we can kind of pick up the pieces from that. But I think our essay shows quite comprehensively that not only is that not possible fiscally, but it won't even deliver the outcomes you're looking to achieve. So that foundational approach, as we call it, rebuilding the civic, social infrastructure at a community level is very important. We also need to look at and talk about prevention, and we're doing further work in that area. We need to look at funding mechanisms that really incentivize long-term prevention. I mean, Patricia Hewitt, in her review of integrated care systems, talked about giving at least 1% of NHS budgets towards prevention. That's the kind of initiative we need to see more of. But I think it also looks at other areas around mutualisation as well. Actually, the biggest success story, which we don't talk enough about in this country, started under New Labour, continued in the coalition, was the mutualisation programme of public services. In my old job at Social Enterprise UK, I used to meet with them regularly, and they're fantastic organisations. There are hundreds of these organisations across the country, and they're delivering better quality care than the public sector, better quality care than the private sector. Just to give one example, Navigo up in northeast Lincolnshire. Again, a spin-out from the public sector, they deliver mental health services. They were a kind of mental health trust under the old model, but they're now kind of self-controlled. And they've managed to not only significantly improve outcomes, they've also managed to keep themselves on budget. And they've done that by being incredibly creative about the way they deliver services. I mean, one of the issues they encountered was that a lot of mental health problems are tied to employment issues. And so what they decided to do was buy a garden centre. Now, how many mental health trusts around the country are going to buy garden centres? Not many. But this social enterprise did, because they realised we can create jobs, we can create employment, it gets them outdoors, it creates social, community opportunities as well. And it's delivered fantastic results. I mean, similarly, they've moved into the housing sector, trying to tackle some of those problems at root cause. If we're going to trust professionals and build on a model that enables that to happen, then we have to look at some of those interventions. And we also need to look at accountability and real kind of citizen participation. Ultimately, you're only going to get effective public service outcomes if citizens are holding all of us in the public-private sector to account for that. And I don't think we've necessarily got there yet. And finally, I guess just on the final point I'd like to raise is just around funding. Now, we've talked about this a lot in a public service context, but my sort of back of the fag packet calculation on my way to this conference. And I thought, well, why am I doing this? But then I remembered Arthur Laffer had designed the whole US tax system on the back of a napkin, so I thought, why not? We've got a 2.5 to 3 trillion pound economy, depending on which measure you use, purchasing power or nominal GDP. 900 billion pounds or so is spent by the state already. Then you start adding things up, our net zero transition as an economy, I'm not just talking about the public sector, is about 80 to 100 billion pounds to combating climate change, things we need to spend as a country every year. If you look at public services, you've probably got another 30 or 40 billion pounds we need to be spending. You're looking at levelling up, that's another 30 or 40 billion pounds a year that you need to be spending to do that effectively if we look at the examples in Germany. Another 20 or 30 billion on defence, which is an issue the centre-left hasn't probably talked about enough, but given post-Ukraine and the kind of geopolitical instability, adding that all up, you're looking at about 200 billion pounds a year, every year, over the next 10 to 20 years to try and get the country in a functional, fit state. And the honest point is, obviously, the state can't fund all that on its own. There's no possible way that can happen. So, and particularly not with the fiscal rules that Labour's given itself, and a centre-left government might give itself. So, how is that going to be achieved? And I think that's where we need to be looking at kind of mobilisation of resources on top of mobilisation of resources. How are we bringing the private sector to leverage in its investments to tackle some of those areas? How are we drawing on community philanthropy, civic resources at a local and at a national level? How do we get the biggest multipliers that we possibly can out of that work? So, again, I know on the net zero agenda, there's been a lot of focus on the kind of Green New Deal and green investment funds from the centre-left. But realistically, what's the business sector's kind of role in funding that? Because if you don't solve some of those questions, there won't be the resources to actually reform public services. So we need to look at a number of different challenges, I think, that are interconnected with public service funding, and not just kind of pretend we're in this bubble where it's all about how much money can we put inside public service reform. Ultimately, there's a huge, the whole of the UK state is crumbling in a variety of different ways, economically, socially, environmentally, that's going to require a significant amount of resource. And we need to have a strategy and a vision for the future which encompasses all those areas, including public services. So I think I'll stop there to give some time for questions, but thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of our speakers for some really interesting and important remarks. And thanks also for keeping to time. So we've got lots of time to take audience questions, so I shan't waste any more time. Hands up if you've got anything to ask. Okay, so we'll take a question there and also over there.
My question I think it's a truth generally acknowledged that most public services are in a very dire state at the moment. I think the challenges for the next government is in terms of the expectations of change for those, and I realise it differs across the health service, different parts of the health service, education, social care, but in reality, some of these problems are so entrenched now. What is it realistic to achieve within a few years, and how much is really probably more a 10-year target? And if so, what are the risks involved in that, in the sense that the population won't be seeing the improvements they necessarily expect straight away?
Thanks. My name's Josh. I'm from the Centre for Social Justice think tank. Just a question on the role of preventative services. I think that's so important. It's something that the state is probably failing to deliver at the moment, but so much of preventative work is already being delivered in communities by the third sector and by charities and community organisations that are really filling the gaps that people are falling through between statutory services. So I'm just wondering, in your minds, does the future of public service delivery look more like being delivered via community organisations and charities and people on the ground in communities, grassrooting public services? I wonder what your views are on that. Thanks.
Thanks. Is there any further questions from the audience at the moment? I'm happy to take 3 at a time. If we take the one in the very back row, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Alistair, and I'm a recent graduate here from Queen Mary. I wanted to focus on this point about education, how we're lagging behind in certain areas. There's also an interesting study that a lot of young people are lacking in particular skills, particularly technological, IT, programming, etc. I was wondering how that could be brought into the fold as well with reforms in education.
Lovely, thank you. So I think if we go in the order that we spoke in, and feel free, to take as many or as few of the questions as you feel you'd like to speak on, and then we'll come back for another round of questions.
Yeah, all great questions. Building on your comments from Demos, any new government is going to have to reach an agreement with the public about what is achievable and what is not achievable, and is going to have to try and reach an agreement that it's going to be a joint effort. And that's obviously fantastically hard in circumstances in which government is held in such low regard by the public, obviously. On the other hand, the public, another way of saying the same thing, is the public doesn't actually expect government to be able to fix these things. I mean, that is the problem with the sort of democratic settlement, isn't it, more generally? It's not a new phenomenon that the public's view of ministers is essentially the same as their view of estate agents. This is well recorded by Mori surveys over the years. Who do you trust the most? Doctors. Who do you trust least? The 2 I've mentioned, civil servants, by the way, in case you're interested, somewhere in the middle. So the public doesn't actually expect a new government to sort out the NHS quickly, which is good. But the question is, could an incoming government find an accommodation with the public which sort of recognises that, and we're going to work together to fix this as best we can? That's the sort of political challenge, and that can be taken in all sorts of directions, of which, mutuals, charities, voluntary support, citizen juries, there's masses of it, isn't there? Policy making that is done collaboratively together, of a sort that I've got more experience of having done 20 years ago than in the last 10. So it's hard, but I agree with the implications of the various questioners that it needs to be, these challenges need to be confronted together, which is one reason why it seems to me there's a much more important role for local government than for central government, and why, although I haven't read your report yet, I'm a little bit nervous about the nationalisation of care, but I probably misunderstood. I've said enough, so I'll come and talk to you afterwards if you want about digital skills.
Yeah, as Jonathan says, great questions. I think on the first question, yes, there are risks. And I think some of the New Labour comparisons maybe encourage that. I mean, obviously, we're in a completely different world, fiscally, economically. So I think what it boils down to is a few things, really. It's having clear priorities, focusing in on those priorities. having the long-term vision, the long-term incremental plans that you can be clear on to offer the combination of reassurance and hope. But absolutely, there is a big problem, as we know, with mistrust, with disengagement among the public. And so having clear plans, I think, is even more important from that perspective, and being able to manage expectations. On delivery of public services, yes, absolutely. And I'm sure Andrew will say more on this, but I think we've seen the failure of contracting out in numerous public services now, probation probably being the latest example. There is huge scope for a greater role for charities, for voluntary sector organisations, for mutuals, for cooperatives across our public services, really. And I think that's one of the most exciting areas of reform for a centre-left government.
To pick up from where Claire left off, in our proposals, we for the adult social care sector, we try to draw a very clear distinction between non-profit providers and independent and for-profit providers, and say that this should be choices for local government deciding what's right for their community, but they should be empowered to create the provider mix that they want, including a much bigger role for non-profits of all sorts. So it could be services, mutuals run by users themselves, or cooperatives of employees, or housing associations, or traditional charities. And actually, this sector I'm talking about is a good model for others, where if you have a network of organisations with a public ethos, but not all of them part of the state, you're likely to get much more diverse and sort of person-focused support than either a public or a traditional outsourced solution. And that very much links into points made about prevention as well. So our report, rather like the Hewitt report, we suggest sort of some top slicing as well, so that a minimum amount of spend on care in every community has to go on open access, preventative sorts of support, rather than sort of assessed, sort of rationed support for people with very high needs. And finally, just to go back to the question of expectations, which is a really good point, and we did talk behind the scenes in developing our proposals about that incredible tension between not over-promising, but at the same time having sort of nothing to show for sort of a process of reform, that people haven't seen change on the ground within. If it was within 5 years and the whole term of a parliament, I think the public would be rightly, sort of entitled to feel that they're being sold a pup. But at the same time, if politicians start making commitments that they already know they'll really struggle to commit to deliver on, then trust in politics gets is sort of further undermined. And I think the thing to do is partly stabilisation, just to make all the workforce issues we've talked about are to make sure that things don't get worse, and that, if you like, the current offer is better delivered, but also finding some symbolic changes that you can make for relatively low amounts of money. So, for example, one proposal in our report, which is quite cheap to do, is to say that everyone gets their first 6 weeks of care after leaving a hospital for free. At least that's a start, even if it's only a very small down payment to the sort of scale of support that's needed. Just want to pick up on Andrew's point about sort of community, which I think was a really important debate to have, sort of society, families, all of that. And actually, in our research on adult social care, we found there's very good academic evidence that it's both, and that if you have good public services, that crowds in delivery by the family and community. And if think about an individual needing support. If they don't get any public service support, it's unsustainable for the family to care, and they end up in a care home. But if you get some public support, you also create a sustainable caring relationship with the family and in the community.
I don't want to kind of cue Elgar music and sepia colour, but I always thought one of the things fascinating about the UK and our political scene is how frightened politicians are of the public and levelling with the public about them. Because as we saw during the pandemic, a very grim period, but the public, particularly on issues around lockdowns, were much more willing to kind of kind of go with that. They recognise the collective sacrifice required and to make changes around that. And purely throughout our history, we've, I think, shown ourselves to be quite a resilient country when it comes to some of those challenges. So I think expectations management is important. I think Jonathan hit the nail on the head. It's sort of saying to the public, it's not, the state can't fix all this on its own. You know, society's going to have to change. Business is going to have to change. Our expectations of what's possible are going to have to change. And I think there is something for any centre-left government to start preparing the ground for that now, because if you don't do it now, when you get into government, you don't get that permission to then say, oh, I know when you elected us, we said everything was going to be all right, but actually, it's not going to be as easy as we thought it was going to be. You know, that's not a great message. Now is the time to be making that message. And I think the public are willing to hear that, and I think there is an opportunity ahead of the election to make that case. So I think honesty is the best policy there. And in terms of prioritisation, I guess, yes, the NHS and I think social care are clearly, I think, national priorities at the moment. I think that's what the public expects. But I think there are also a number of areas, particularly around law and order and criminal justice, for example, where, again, we haven't talked about a lot of that today, but, you know, there is a sense of kind of this fraying social order that we have and that nobody's got a grip of it. So I think probably those two pillars have to be at the core of the immediate short-term issues around public services, and then, you know, looking at areas like education and university and higher education and further education as well. And of course, I mean, yes, of course I agree, you know, charities and mutualisation and social enterprises and various different other types of models. I guess, I know this is called hard questions for the centre-left, so I guess kind of my hard question to the audience and to the centre-left, I suppose, is, you know, what did you like and dislike about the big society? Because I know, being there at the time, there was a lot, frankly, from the centre-left and the left more broadly about how it was rubbish and, you know, this is just all pie in the sky, wishful thinking. And I think a lot of that is true. The criticisms were true. I mean, it was a vague notion that was chucked out there, and there wasn't enough support and capacity given to it. But the kernel of that, as that sense of how do we mobilise communities, how do we mobilise citizens to kind of take control, for want of a better phrase, take back control of public services and so on. There was something in that, and education, I guess, is one of those areas where it was most prevalently implemented. And, you know, I think the centre-left has to kind of think a little bit about philosophically in its vision for what, you know, what do you think about those kind of models? What do you think about some of those questions? And I guess I still don't really see, I mean, I do agree with you, Andrew, it is and, you know, it's not either or. But the balance of that, where resources are going, I was at a meeting, I won't say with which Shadow Cabinet Minister recently, and we talked about this exact issue and sort of said, well, okay, yeah, but where's the resource going to go? Because if it's all going to go into the state and none of it's going to go into the third sector, you know, this partnership won't exist. And it was a bit of umming and ahhing and going, well, you know, we'll have a think about it. And I think that's where the kind of rubber meets the road. And I think when it came to issues like the big society, there was, at least through issues like social investment, looking at issues around open public services, there was a desire to get money out into that sector, social value act, social value reform. So again, what does the centre-left think about that? I don't really know yet. I think that's still a big area to be worked out, but it needs to be figured out pretty quickly, because otherwise this kind of model of a reinforced, reinvigorated public sector with a kind of wraparound from the civic space, it simply won't be there because the resources won't be there to do that. And when you talk to most charities, most social enterprises, mutuals, real desire to participate, just no capacity, no investment, no kind of partnership to do that. So, and I think the centre-left historically has been a bit worried about that, I suppose, because there is variation that comes with that. You know, the more charity, the more social enterprise provision, mutual provision you get, the less control you have over it. And I think at Demos, our certain view is that we need to be much more trusting, I think, towards those kind of groups and organisations, being outcomes-led rather than kind of process-led. So I think it's a really great point.
Okay, so we're going to take some further questions from the audience, but just before I do that, before I forget, we've got a pre-prepared question from somebody in the audience, which I'm going to read, and then I'll take 2 further questions. So the question is, since it's widely accepted that the NHS is one of the most important public services from cradle to grave, the late Queen recommended the NHS be awarded the George Cross to ensure that the NHS remains at the forefront of public and political consciousness. Should it promote this, and should it be included in all communications? So there's one to think about, and then we'll just take 2 further questions from the audience. Okay, so we'll take this one on this side. And then I'll go towards the back on the right.
Great, thank you. Ben Schretter from Nesta. Just wondering, what countries do you think we could learn from for improving our public services? And yeah, please choose any of the public services and any country you think we could learn useful insights from.
Hi, my name is Richard, and I'm not associated or affiliated to anybody in particular. My question is about the National Care Service, which seems to have at the absolute core of it the notion of taking top-level decision-making away from local authorities and giving it to Whitehall, which is not necessarily the wrong thing to do, but is an unusual thing to be suggesting just at this moment. Is that correct, or am I misunderstanding?
Okay. Would we like to go in reverse order this time? Don't want to let Jonathan have all the first dibs on the questions.
Sure, yeah. So I think if I understand the first question correctly, there is something about, I suppose, recognition and how do we encourage people to go above and beyond. I think IPPR, again, produced a really good paper recently about public services and talking about how we need to rely, rather than kind of competitive external pressures, more on intrinsic motivations. That's why people join public services, because they have a passion for children or helping people in poverty or health or criminal justice and rehabilitation, whatever it is. And it is, how do we build that out? And I do think there is more that we could be doing in that area. I think honours are an important part of that system, and George Cross is obviously an example of that. But I think also there are other things that we could be doing, and it's not just simply questions around pay as well, but it's sort of also looking at some of the kind of wider recognition that people get within society for that. But I think it's being very clear that that is not just simply a way of brushing off issues around financial performance and the investment in public service as well. I mean, ultimately, honours and recognition is not going to pay for hospital beds, it's not going to pay for social care. So we do need to be realistic about that, but I think it does hold a particularly important role in that question. And I guess I'm not going to answer the National Care Service one. You can do that one. But just on the examples of other countries, I mean, the country I've been looking at most, I guess, is Japan, I think. And there's some really interesting examples of work they're doing there at a neighbourhood level. So public health issues around social care are actually often dealt with at a kind of hyper-local ward level. Now, they've got a very particular type of social model, very particular type of economic model. But obviously, with a rapidly ageing society, and they're very much our future in 10 to 15 years' time, I think there's a lot to learn about how they've tried to balance, on the one hand, public provision for services, whilst at the same time creating that space for people's that family, community, civic kind of contribution to be maintained. And I think there's definitely work to be done there. And I think, again, in the UK, I would say, and it's a good reason your question is a very good question, is often I think there is a level of kind of isolationism when it comes to our public service reform agenda. We do tend to think we need to do everything from scratch, or we're a very unique circumstance, but I don't think that is true. And I think certainly we could all do from doing a lot more work kind of drawing those international examples. So yeah, that's my favourite of the countries at the moment.
On the George Cross question, I think there's a real risk of sort of post-pandemic, the sort of honouring without rewarding. And there's sort of, I think there's a real jadedness from public sector workers, sort of the clapping versus the huge pressures that are placed on their jobs. So I think, and that might be an outcome of the pandemic inquiry, not just for the NHS, but I think you've got to think about material conditions more. We held a seminar recently on working time, and one of our proposals was that you ban unpaid overtime. And the pale faces you see from anyone involved in the public sector when you make that suggestion. So that is a sort of, how do you actually improve the material conditions of hard-pressed public servants? It's really difficult conversations like that rather than honours. On the question of the National Care Service, so this is a really, I'm glad you asked it. It's a really important point because, all our instincts along, with this generation of Labour politicians are towards localism. So the idea that you create a big national, sort of superstructure over
public service provision sort of goes against the spirit of the times. When we talk to local government, they actually said we're desperate for government to do some of the things that no one is doing, and we don't have the capacity to do. So our approach in thinking about the service is to empower and facilitate local government to do what it's good at by having some light touch national functions that wouldn't be a big new bureaucracy. It would all be sort of like within the existing department. But finance should be done at national level to ensure there's an investment strategy and also to fairly distribute money around the country, which it isn't. Workforce needs to be done at a national level to make sure that you have the fair deal that I talked to, and regulation of large national providers needs to happen on a national level, because individual local authorities aren't in a position to take on these big chains which have, and don't have the capacity to understand, their business model and tax treatment and all of that. That needs national financial regulation. But the assumption should be as local as possible and as personal as possible. So it's the individual and an empowered employee making choices about what support's right for them, rather than lots of traditional top-down national sort of impositions on a service.
Just briefly, just on question one, just to pick up on Andrew's point about unpaid care. I mean, unpaid overtime. The biggest concern I think we all share there is unpaid carers and the hours that many people are doing, and which will only grow as our population ages. And IPPR's proposed limits actually to those hours, which you could only realise if you had the sorts of formal care provision that we've heard about in place. So that would be my point on that. On countries, I think we often overlook our close neighbours. I'm going to make a pitch for Scotland, for Wales. Scotland and its some of its social security reforms in the past few years, particularly around child poverty. There's a lot that we can learn there. Wales, I've mentioned the foundational economy innovations that the Welsh Government has really pursued, but equally the Future Generations Act is a fantastic piece of legislation which is kind of trailblazing around the world. So Scotland and Wales.
Hi. Well, I mentioned Ireland on reading and Germany on skills, so I won't say anything more about that. I really am going to have to read your report, obviously, like everybody else on National Care Service. Be careful. You have thought about this already, but local education authorities still exist. And when I worked for Joe as a director of education in Islington 20 years ago, he was right to expect that I would know what was going on in each school, the bedpan equivalent. It's generally not a good idea, in my experience, for the Secretary of State to expect his or her civil servants to know what's going on in an individual school. It's not a good way to run schools, to have 20,000 of them reporting to the Secretary of State, and that is the system. And I'm sure you're designing something different, but be careful. And actually, my final point relates to the question about what is achievable with limited resources. When there are thousands of multi-academy trusts, and the average one's got 4 schools in it, and there are 150 local education authorities, and there's no agreement in a very sort of big P political, ideological world about progressives, there's an enormous amount of duplicative and unused capacity. And genuinely a thing a centre-left government could do, it wouldn't be that hard. Work with MAT leaders, multi-academy trust leaders, the schools, unions, local government, we're in it together. It's hard. Let's work together rather than fighting each other. There is a lot of capacity that could be generated actually quite quickly.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left. I'm going to invite anyone on the panel to share perhaps something else. If they have, anything burning that they'd like to finish by saying, you can each just have a moment. And if not, then we can wrap up. Yeah? Okay.
I'm going to, I guess my final kind of thing, and this is not just due for public service, I think it's everywhere. I think the question for the centre-left and all parts of the political spectrum is, what are you prepared to sacrifice? What are you prepared to give up to build a consensus, because ultimately, if reforms are going to last, like we saw in, for example, in the education setting, which Jonathan's more expert than I are on, but there was a kind of general acceptance at the end of the 2000s that, in that sort of that initial decade, the Conservatives sort of accepted a lot of what Labour was doing and were willing to take that forward and build on it, maybe not always in the way that Labour had intended, but there was an agreement to do that. I think in many other areas there isn't that sense of where compromises can be made. And compromise doesn't have to be something wet and sort of unappealing politically. But in somewhere like public services, where it's a bit of an oil tanker and it takes many, many years to get things moving, there does need to be some recognition on all sides of kind of where are we willing to give something up? Where are we willing to compromise on a particular principle or area in order to create something that can be genuinely long-lasting and transformational? And I think that's just as much true for the right as it is for the left. And I know maybe at this point in the electoral cycle, the left doesn't feel much like compromising, or the centre left doesn't feel much like compromising. But I think that is just a point, I think, to reflect on is, how will this stuff actually continue beyond the legacy of the initial 5 years of a centre-left government if it was to be elected?
Okay, I think that was a really nice note to end on. So I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers for engaging us in a really, really fascinating discussion about public services, and invite you all to say thank you too.